mean, Carel LaRue, who's one of the scientists who worked on key stages of the development of these drugs, said to me, there's two kinds of drugs in the world. There's drugs that have side effects and drugs that don't work, right? And he's right about that. I mean, for most people, the side effects are manageable. I did interview some people for whom the side effects were just horrific. For example, there's a woman called Sunny Newton in Vermont who I interviewed who, she became violently sick, the way she described it. And she really stuck it out as well. She took it for 18 months, but she said it felt like there was a kind of alien living inside her who was thrashing about. She would have it's another very common side effect. She would have extreme burping and these weird metallic tastes.
That was multiple New York Times bestselling author Johann Hari talking about the weight loss drug Ozempic. In his new book, Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks, the new weight loss drugs is the topic of today's conversation. Johan is one of my favorite people on the planet. His first conversation on the podcast talking about his book, Lost Connections in 2020, is still one of my favorite ever podcasts, one of my most downloaded episodes. And his book is one I go back and reread every year when it talks about the real cause of depression and anxiety. It had such a positive impact on me. And I'm so grateful that we've built up this friendship over the years, because he is such an incredible and wonderful person and an even better storyteller. And in today's podcast, we talk about weight loss drugs. We talk about Ozempic in particular, and the pros and the cons, because I think, and it's very easy to label this as a wonder drug that potentially is going to change the world for weight loss, or on the other end of the spectrum, nobody should be taking this. It's going to cause all sorts of issues and potential diseases and risks down the line. And what I loved about Johann's book, he sent me an advanced copy to read, was it talks about the black, it talks about the white, and it talks about the grey. It talks about the good, the bad, and the indifferent. And in today's podcast, we go through it. So if you are curious about Ozempic, either for yourself, family members, or you work with professionals, or you're a professional working with people who are curious about this, you are going to get a very well-rounded conversation on what you need to know about these drugs from personal experience from Johan and from his research through the last couple of years in the writing of this book. So without further ado, here is the hat-trick appearance, another great conversation with one of my favorite people, multiple times New York Times best-selling author Johann Hari, on the extraordinary benefits and disturbing risks of Ozempic and other weight loss drugs. Enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I am delighted to be joined today with my guest, one of my favorite people and a show favorite, Johann Hari. Johann is the author of 3 New York Times bestselling books that have been translated into more than 37 languages and have been praised by a broad range of people, from Oprah to Noam Chomsky, from Elton John to Naomi Klein. His new book, Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks, the New Weight Loss Drugs, is available everywhere now. This is his hat-trick appearance on the podcast. You can listen to episode 281 from June 2020, Johann Hari on Lost Connections and uncovering the real cause of depression and anxiety and the unexpected solutions, and episode 363 in January 2022, the last time we spoke, titled Anxiety, Stolen Focus, and Why You Can't Pay Attention. I'm looking forward to talking all things Ozempic and weight loss drugs in today's show. Johann, welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, I'm well chuffed to be with you, Brian. Thanks.
Johann, this is on top of you being one of my favorite people, because I love when we get to have these conversations. Your books are unbelievable. I think your storytelling is second to absolutely none. But the topic is so relevant for this audience and this podcast when it comes to weight loss drugs and Ozempic in particular. I'm going to pull out from early on in the book. It's a quote, and we're going to use that as a jumping off point. And it was towards the back end of the first chapter. This is why, as I felt the Ozempic course through my veins for the first time, I needed to know, what kind of magic exactly is this? For those who don't know, talk to us about Ozempic, what it is, and then we can use that as a catalyst for the conversation.
Yeah, there's 3 ways these drugs could be magic, right? So people who don't know, I spent a year traveling all over the world, taking these drugs and interviewing the leading experts, the biggest critics, the biggest supporters, the people who created the drugs themselves. And I met a kind of crazy mixture of people, because it has so many effects on so many things you don't really think about. I ended up traveling from, a stadium full of trampolining teenagers in Iceland, to a diet expert who watched me eat a cinnamon roll in Minneapolis, to a restaurant in Tokyo that was deliberately serving poisonous fish. We could talk about that later. And so for people who don't know, the experts kept explaining to me, this time something really is different. We now have a class of drugs that secures really significant long-term weight loss. So for Ozempic Wegovy, the average person who takes it will lose 15% of their body weight in a year. For Monjaro, which is a slightly newer weight loss drug working on similar principles, it's 21%. And actually for the next load of drugs that are coming down the line that'll be available fairly soon, it's 24%. So this is just a staggering level of weight loss, and it's going to have huge implications in loads of ways. I mean, Barclays Bank commissioned a very sober-minded financial analyst to figure out, what will be the implications of this so they can give people guidance on investment. And she came back and said, the best comparison for the effect this is going to have, the unpredictable effects this is going to have, is the invention of the smartphone, right? So this is huge in some ways that are very positive, in some ways that I worry could be very negative. And it was interesting for me because I was really conflicted about these drugs at the start. Part of me was really skeptical, part of me was very enthusiastic. And here I am after a year having done loads of research on this, and I'm still very conflicted, although I have reached some pretty firm conclusions. I'm still very conflicted. There's still a lot that worries me and a lot that is really good about these drugs. So it's a kind of complicated picture that's emerging. And I think anyone who's talking about these drugs, who's either just kind of like, rah, 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 they're great, nothing to worry about here, or the people who are just like, this is evil and terrible, are missing the truth, which is a kind of complex, muddy middle.
That's what I loved about the book, because I said to you right before we went on air, I stay on top of this because I work in the fitness industry. I run a fitness company, but it's clinical trials that I'm staying on top of. And you're getting a lot of the evidence coming back from experiments. You've quoted some of the studies in the book that I came across myself independently, but you have firsthand experience. And the way that you were able to tell the story really shifted my perspective on it, from the good, the bad, the ugly, and how it could potentially change some people's lives and destroy other people's lives. And I think that's where the real interesting point is. Talk to us about your first 6 months on Ozempic, because you were talking about, I think it was your friend Danielle who was pregnant, where you were doing like an inverse. Her belly was going up, you found that you were going in reverse, and that you went from like 32 to about 22% body fat. Talk to us a little bit about those first 6 months.
It was like I was in a kind of reverse pregnancy. It all began in this weird way. It was the end of 2022, and for the first time since the start of the pandemic, because remember that moment, it was when COVID just seemed to be ending, or the worst aspects of COVID seemed to be ending. So I went to a party for the first time in 2 years, right? And the party was thrown by kind of a Hollywood star, and I expected, I had put on a lot of weight during COVID. I put on about 1.5 stone. And I expected, okay, Hollywood people, they're not going to have podged out quite as much as the rest of us, but they're going to be fatter too. It's going to be quite satisfying to see them all looking a bit fat. And I turned up and I wandered around, and everyone was like much thinner. Everyone looked like their own Snapchat filter. It was this really weird effect, and not just the kind of really famous people, but like the agents partners. I was like, this is weird. And I bumped into a friend of mine at the party, and I said to her, wow, it looks like everyone really did take up Pilates during, the pandemic. And she laughed. And then she sort of saw something in my face that I wasn't kidding. And she said, right, this isn't Pilates, don't you? And I sort of looked at her blankly, and on her phone, she brought up an image of an Ozempic pen. And I had not heard of these drugs up to that point. And obviously I then went away and read a lot about them. And I remember, just like I say, feeling so conflicted, because I thought, I'm someone whose weight has gone from being, throughout my life, sort of yo-yoed from being underweight to being obese, right? And I've never really been able to get a handle on that from my sort of late teens onwards. And I thought, wow, this is a problem, obesity, which has been massively rising. It causes terrible health problems on average, terrible health problems, from diabetes to dementia to cancer. If we've got something that solves that relatively easily, that's a huge gift to the world, right? But I also thought, this isn't a crisis that happened because of some biological flaw, right? The year I was born, 1979, 6% of British people were obese. Today it's 27% and rising, right? And actually the rates of childhood obesity are just skyrocketing. That didn't happen because we all got some biological ailment, right? That happened because of profound changes in the food system primarily, although there are some other factors as well. And I thought, wow, this seems a bit risky, right? What do we know about these drugs? I looked at it. There's all sorts of things we really don't know. And the thing that made me take a leap to take it was one of my oldest friends, someone I really loved, who I had bonded with over being fat, frankly. It was a thing we made jokes about all the time. She died at the height of COVID. She'd had a series of problems that are all made both more likely or worse by obesity. She'd had cancer, then terrible back problems, then COVID. And I realized, I was 44 at the time. I realized I had just become older than my grandfather ever got to be, because my grandfather died of a heart attack when he was 44. So obviously I never knew him. And my dad had had heart problems. My uncle died of a heart attack. And it's funny, when you're young, the problems related to obesity seem very abstract and far away. Suddenly I started to think, oh shit, this isn't so far away now. So with a lot of doubts and a lot of discomfort, I started taking these drugs. And I remember the very first day, the first time I took them, I was too much of a wuss to inject myself. I got my friend Rosie to do it, even though actually it's the tiniest little. It's an EpiPen. It's like you'd barely feel it. Now I do it without even thinking. I remember, some people talk about when they're about to die, they have near-death experiences. I had a sort of food near-death experience where I thought of all the food that I've eaten in my life, right? And I have eaten nothing but shit in my life, right? So I thought of like salt and vinegar chipsticks, Finder's crispy pancakes, so much KFC. I've been to so many branches of McDonald's in the world. I've been to the lowest branch of McDonald's in the world in the Dead Sea. I've been to the first branch of McDonald's they ever opened in Moscow. I've been to the most dangerous branch of McDonald's in the world in El Salvador. I've been to the dodgiest branch of McDonald's at the end of the Strip in Vegas by the Luxor. And it's like there are 38,000 branches of McDonald's in the world, and I felt like I saw them all appearing before me and then slowly disappearing. And then the next day I woke up, and the strangest thing had happened. I woke up and I was lying there and I thought, there's something odd here. But I didn't feel bad. I couldn't place it. And then I realized I wasn't hungry. I always wake up hungry normally. I wake up really hungry. And I wasn't hungry. And I went to, just up the road from here, there's a lovely little cafe that I go to every morning. And the woman who runs it, Tatiana, a Brazilian woman, I said my normal order, which was like a big chicken mayo roll, and she brought it over to me. And I had like 2 mouthfuls and I felt full. That's what happens when you take these drugs. You feel full very, very quickly. I'll explain why later. And then I just didn't want to eat anymore. And I left. And I remember her calling after me, are you all right? Because she thought there was something wrong with me. And then for lunch, I went to the Turkish restaurant near my office where I normally go. And again, I ordered my normal meal, which was a Mediterranean lamb. And again, I had a couple of mouthfuls and I didn't want to eat anymore. And then that night I went to meet my friend in Camden Market and I just couldn't eat anything. And it was really, really weird. And it kind of continued from there. It was like what happened is these drugs radically dialed down my appetite, I would say by like 80%. I mean, there were some bad things that happened as well that I'm sure we'll talk about, but it was a very rapid and quite shocking effect.
Johan, before you took the first dose, did you have a misconception or a conception in your head that it would reduce your hunger, or did you think that it would change the cravings that you had for certain foods, or what were your expectations going in? Put yourself into the position before you took the first dose, because I understand that hunger craving. I work with a lot of people with their weight and have done for the last decade. And I know that hunger can sound like, oh my God, if I just wasn't hungry, I would be totally fine and I'd be able to get my weight down, which is true in a lot of cases for some people. And it can sound like a silver bullet. So we will touch on the bad things as we go along. But before you took the first dosage, what was your expectation of how it was going to work? If any.
I had spoken to a few people who'd taken it. And what's interesting is different people have quite different reactions. So some people, the first person I spoke to who had taken it was a foodie who'd gotten very overweight. And he loves food. And for him, it was just awful because it killed his pleasure in food. And I'm a little bit sad to say, I didn't have that experience, but not for a particularly good reason. I realized from when I was very young, again, for reasons we can talk about, my relationship with food, well, firstly, I grew up just eating absolute shit, right? Like just really like the worst of the worst. I was ahead of the curve on this. My primary pleasure in food from when I was very young and pretty much all my life was not the pleasure of the taste of the food, although I got some pleasure from that. It wasn't nothing. The primary pleasure was the feeling of stuffing myself. So I would always eat too much. Stuffing is a very particular form of eating. It's where you eat beyond the point at which you're full. And it's a physical sensation when you're stuffed. I mean, everyone will have been stuffed at some point. Everyone gets stuffed on Christmas Day or whatever. But it's when you're stuffed, it's like you feel that pressure outwards on your stomach and upwards on your esophagus, right? And I think my eating was primarily to get that sensation rather than the pleasure of savoring a taste or anything like that. And actually for me, I'm an outlier here, right? I'm not presenting my experience as typical, it's atypical, to be sure. It actually really significantly increased the pleasure I took in food from basically almost nothing to a little bit of pleasure sometimes, right? Partly because it massively slowed down how I eat. I mean, I remember going for dinner with a friend of mine about a month after I started taking them, and her saying to me, it's always up to now been very disconcerting eating with you because you would eat so much so quickly, but you never really looked like you were enjoying it. So actually, because it slowed me down, I don't want to act like I'm suddenly become some foodie. I'm never going to be that guy, but it had improved me. So actually, I think the warnings I had ahead of time were ones that ended up not really applying to me, although certainly everyone I knew who'd taken it had reduced their appetite, and it undoubtedly did that to me.
I know after 6 months, you started to notice that obviously the weight was coming down, but you had these other negative impacts, that your mood was strangely muted. You felt a bit listless. You just weren't excited for the day as you normally would be. In the beginning, did you notice negative effects, or did that take longer to come on?
There's a few immediate negative effects that almost everyone experiences at first. They generally go away. The clinical trials have been very clear about this. Almost from the vast majority of people, they go away or go down to a very manageable level. So almost everyone, when they start to take it, experiences nausea. So that's why they always start you on a low dose of 0.25 milligrams. You can now build up in Britain to 1.75 milligrams, and it goes significantly higher in the US. So at first, yeah, I was nauseous. Like the day after I took it, I would feel, if I just was doing nothing, if I was just sitting in my home or whatever, it was like mild, but it wouldn't have stopped me doing anything in my normal life. If just one day I had woken up and I'd felt that nauseous, I wouldn't have not gone about my day. But for me, it took the form of a slightly, when I was traveling, so even like being on the bus or the train, I would get a sort of exaggerated sense of travel sickness. Again, it wasn't horrific. I wasn't throwing up, but it was unpleasant. Like it was an unpleasant sensation. And some people get just really horrendous nausea. So in the clinical trials, about 10% of people just had to stop because the nausea was so bad, even on the low doses, or as they built up their doses. So it was nausea. A lot of people get constipation because it slows down your gastric emptying. I mean, those are the most common side effects, along with loss of pleasure in food, which can be a more lasting effect. I mean, Carel Leroux, who's one of the scientists who worked on key stages of the development of these drugs, said to me, there's two kinds of drugs in the world. There's drugs that have side effects and drugs that don't work, right? and he's right about that. I mean, for most people, the side effects are manageable. I did interview some people for whom the side effects were just horrific. For example, there's a woman called Sunny Newton in Vermont who I interviewed who, she became violently sick. The way she described it, and she really stuck it out as well. She took it for 18 months, but she said it felt like there was a kind of alien living inside her who was thrashing about. She would have it's another very common side effect. She would have extreme burping and these weird metallic tastes because it slows your gut down. The part of your valve, your gut that opens, just doesn't open as quickly. So the gas goes back up, right? That's why you burp. So yeah, I had, the usual mixture of mild side effects. For me, the most unpleasant, which is one that actually most people don't get, but it is listed in the side effect profile, is for some people, it can make their heart beat faster. And that made me feel anxious. Your body naturally interprets your heart beating fast as anxiety. And that was quite unpleasant. I had it for quite a few months as well. That wasn't a nice feeling. It's gone away now. But that wasn't a nice feeling. But for me, the most significant effects, and again, I'm an outlier here, were the kind of mood effects, which are much debated, and I can go into if you want.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, but you might be able to shine some light on this because we spoke in our first episode about anxiety, depression, history of the drugs that supported and the alternative viewpoints and getting connected, like that Lost Connections, as I mentioned in that podcast, one of the books that changed my life like no other, second to none, in terms of life changes, and helped me manage and see a lot of the issues that I had in terms of life choices that I made that weren't supporting my anxiety and mental health. Do you think that your history and life up until that point and experience impacted some of the side effects that were prevalent, or do you think it's just a case of this is the drug and this was the side effect? What were your kind of thoughts, or what realization did you come to with that?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, my life was in a really good place when I started taking these drugs. And in my experience, my depression had been very much a reaction to both childhood trauma and things happening in my life. And my life was going really well. And I feel, in as much as you ever can with extreme childhood trauma, I feel that I'd really kind of processed that and dealt with it. So I was in a good state going in. And I wouldn't want to overstate the mood effects on me. You described it well, Brian. I would wake up and just have this slightly muted feeling. And this is happening to, so most people taking these drugs, that is not happening to. Most people are really glad they lose the weight and feel physically fitter. And that often makes people feel mentally better. But there's a significant minority of people who seem to be experiencing negative mood consequences. And actually, this fits with a wider body of evidence that we have. We don't have that much data or knowledge yet about, I mean, we've got a fair bit now, but we don't have as much as we'd like on these drugs. But we do have a very good comparison point, which is bariatric surgery, right? So the next most common form of extreme weight loss that's ever happened. I mean, sometimes obviously people go on crash diets, we can look at them, but usually those diets don't work and it's not sustained weight loss over the long term. But the form of weight loss that is most similar to this is bariatric surgery. It's not identical for obvious reasons. And we know, and that should really guide, I think a lot of the evidence from bariatric surgery should be guiding us in how we think about these drugs, both the benefits and the risks. So the benefits are very clear. If you reverse obesity, you massively improve people's health outcomes on average, right? In the 7 years after people have bariatric surgery, you are 56% less likely to die of a heart attack, 60% less likely to die of cancer, 90% less likely to die of diabetes-related causes, and 40% less likely to die of any cause at all, right? So that, I mean, the evidence is clear. Reverse obesity, you enormously boost health. But there's another set of pieces of evidence from bariatric surgery, apart from the fact that it's a very grisly operation and actually 1 in 1,000 people die during the operation. But even apart from that, one of the things that I found really interesting and wanted to look into more and did research more was something that pertains to your question, which is 17% of people who have bariatric surgery are so distressed afterwards they have to have inpatient psychiatric treatment, and your suicide risk after bariatric surgery quadruples, which is remarkable, right? I mean, it still remains low because the risk of suicide is in the general population is low, but quadrupling is a very significant, almost quadrupling is a very significant increase. So there's basically, in relation to these drugs, two very broad theories about why they might be causing some people to feel worse. And I put them into two kinds of buckets. I'm putting this pretty crudely, but it's basically right. There are psychological explanations that it might affect how we think, how we feel about ourselves, and how we act. And then there are brain-based explanations. So remind me to talk about the brain-based ones later because they're super fascinating. But let's look at the psychological ones first, if that's okay. When we eat, we all eat for a range of reasons, right? So that if you'd asked me, 2 years ago, Johan, why do you eat? I would have said, well, obviously I eat to sustain and maintain my body and to make sure I'm not hungry, right? And that's obviously the most important function of eating. If you don't eat, you die. But actually, before I started on these drugs, I was eating about 3,200 calories a day. Now I eat about 1,800 and I'm not hungry, right? So, and here you can see I'm alive, I'm well, my body is being sustained, right? That's a lot of calories that were doing some other job, right? It was interesting, I went through the evidence. There's actually 5 reasons why people eat food, and we've talked about the pleasure that people get from food. But I'll give you an example of another one that's very, very common. Huge numbers of people, and I was definitely in this category, a large part of their eating is driven by the need for comfort, right? It's a really interesting study of this, that, people saying, oh, when I feel anxious, I eat and I'm soothed like a baby is soothed, right? And there's lots of evidence for comfort eating. The night Donald Trump was elected, sales of comforting junk food massively skyrocketed in blue states, but did not skyrocket in red states, right? You look at this really interesting evidence from the NFL League, the National Football League in the US. When the home team wins in a particular town, sales of comfort food go down by 16%. And when they win, sales of common comfort foods go down by 9%, right? So we eat when we don't feel good, a lot of us, right? We eat to soothe ourselves, to reassure ourselves, to make ourselves feel good or stabilized or calm. And one of the things that happens when you're on these drugs is you really struggle to do that, right? You can force yourself to eat, but it's the way I would describe it is, imagine you've just had your massive Christmas dinner, you're finished and you're lying on the sofa, and I came up to you and said, "Hey, Brian, I bought you a KFC bucket, right? Here you go, have some." I mean, you could physically make yourself do it, but it would be grotesque to you, right? That is how excessive eating seems to you. Even quite low levels of excessive eating seem to you when you're taking these drugs, right? So I remember one day, a few months into taking them, I'd had a bad day, not like horrific or anything, but I had a bad day. And I did what I would normally do on a bad day. I did it almost on a kind of psychological autopilot. I went to my local branch of KFC, right? And I ordered I won't even say it's so disgusting, but like a range of chicken-based products. And I remember sitting there and looking at it and just thinking, I can't eat this. And I remember Colonel Sanders' face looking down at me as if he was like really puzzled, like, wait, our best customer, what happened to him? But I just couldn't eat it, right? And I thought, you're just going to have to sit here and feel these feelings, aren't you? There's no alternative to this. And I think that is happening to lots of people on these drugs, right? And that leads us back to the evidence about bariatric surgery. Lots of things happen when people have bariatric surgery. Some of it may well be a response to actually, it's quite physically onerous, the recovery from the operation. But some of it is, you can't comfort eat anymore. You certainly can't comfort eat the way you used to. Some of it is also about self-perception. I don't think this was going on with me, but I remember some scientists who'd worked with bariatric surgery patients saying to me, a lot of people who carry excessive weight imagine, one day when I lose this weight, my life will be good, right? And they lose all this weight and suddenly they're doing the same job and they're with the same husband and they're in the same life. And it's like the thing about, you get the thing you've longed for and you believe is the solution, but actually it hasn't solved all your problems. So I think there's lots of things going on there, but I think there's a big set of sort of psychological factors. It's only when your eating patterns are radically disrupted that you really begin to see what your eating was doing for you in the first place. So I would say to anyone who's thinking about taking these drugs, there's many reasons why people overeat. They're complicated. There's lots of them I discuss in the book. Some people will be listening to this and thinking, well, I don't comfort eat and that's not going on with me, and you're not atypical if that's you. But know that it will likely bring up all sorts of issues that you were not aware of or only vaguely aware of that will start to come to the surface. Now, that is no bad thing, right? A friend of mine said to me, it's not causing these problems, it's just making you aware of them, right? Mm-hmm. And they're absolutely right. And it was indeed solving some physical problems for me, physical risks, obviously, to my health. So yeah, again, with almost everything about these drugs, it's a complicated picture.
It's so interesting, Johan. You've given me a beautiful segue into what I wanted to talk about next. But as somebody who's spent the last more than a decade working with people with weight loss, with fat loss, getting their weight down, some people morbidly obese to begin with, one thing that I would always say to them at the beginning is, I can't guarantee you'll feel any happier about your life if we lose this weight. I was like, if you hate the relationship you're in, if you hate your job, if your family aren't supportive, you can lose the weight and we can drop 3 stone, 4 stone, 5 stone, and you'll weigh less on the scale. Your risk of all-cause mortality will go down. Your health will be improved, but you might not feel happier. And that's a really important distinction to make, because I think if you take a drug in particular, you can have this misalignment that I'll be happy when I lose the weight, and you put all of this nearly added extra pressure to the end result. And then when life doesn't improve and you still have all these other problems, you're like, oh, what do I do now? And that can be an issue. And there's a line in your book, I'm going to pull out another quote. and you said that the truth is, and this is verbatim, that in 7 months into taking Ozempic, I was banking the benefits of the weight loss, but almost nothing, no other changes in my life. And that you were still pretty much eating the same food, just eating considerably less of it. And that's been my professional issue going into the research. Even when I started reading the book, that was my bias coming in, was if it helps people get from 0 to 1 and they make positive changes with the nutrition, it might be something that can be really helpful, particularly for those who are morbidly obese and can't do anything. But when people don't make those lifestyle changes, there might not be a sustainability element there, or potentially even heightening the health benefits. Talk to us a little bit about that, because you mentioned there earlier that, you know, you ordered the same thing for breakfast, ordered the same thing for lunch, you still went to KFC, you were just eating considerably less of it. Talk to us a little bit about that realization after 7 months.
Yeah, you've put it really well, Brian, in that I think I felt, there were lots of things going on in my head at the time. One was, I felt like I was cheating, right? It took me a long time to think about why I felt that. I had to do a lot of thinking and interviewing to really understand this, because it's such an odd thing, right? Like, if you had a heart problem and you took statins, I wouldn't be like, Brian, he's cheating, that fucker. Why is he... These statins, fuck you, right? I wouldn't think you were like the Lance Armstrong of statins, right? And yet, huge numbers of people, including a lot of people taking the drug, feel like they're cheating. And I think it goes to these very deep ideas about how we think about fatness, weight gain. You go right back to the 6th century, the Pope describes the 7 deadly sins, Pope Gregory I, and, what does he put on it? Gluttony, right? And these images of fat people looking like devils. And if you look at the forms of weight loss we admire are very much on the model of the kind of old Catholic model of sin. As an Irish person who can understand this very well, you sin, you have to suffer and be punished horribly, and then you get to redemption, right? So the forms of weight loss we admire very much follow that pattern. If you torture yourself through starvation, if you go through extreme forms of exercise that are really incredibly difficult, then we'll go, okay, we'll forgive you. You paid your price, right? But this feels like almost like, the Catholic Church in the 15th, 16th century used to sell indulgences, right? They go, you killed someone, but if you give us this amount of money, we'll say that God's forgiven you, right? This feels like buying an indulgence almost. And I thought, God, what a fucked up way of thinking. How did that get into my head, that I had this fucked up way of thinking, that I was like some sinner who's done this evil thing and needs to be punished? It's like, do I think that about my friend who died, that she deserved to be punished? Of course not. Do I think about my grandmother who was, very overweight? Of course not, right? So I think it's partly that dynamic was going on, but I think you're right about the question about the sustainability. So this is one of the big questions about these drugs, right? So what we know is, there's a few things we know, we think we know. I've been taking these drugs for a year and a few months now. We're speaking in March. If I stopped taking these drugs now, if I'm statistically typical, I would regain almost all the weight I've lost in the next year, about 70% of it, right? So it looks like, this is now being disputed, it looks like there's some subgroup of people, clearly there's 30% even in those studies, but it may be more. There's some people, almost certainly people who made where it led them to make big lifestyle changes, for whom that's not true. But, this is more like statin. If you think about, treatment for malaria, you've got malaria, you take the drug, your malaria goes away. This is not like that. It's not a cure for obesity. It's a treatment for a chronic ongoing issue, right? More like taking statins for heart disease or taking insulin for diabetes. You've got to take it forever or the effects go away, right? So this is not a casual thing to start doing. This is you're not going into a holiday fling, you're getting married, right? There's also a debate, and this is one of the things that prompted me to change. Like you say, I was eating smaller portions of the same old shit, right? Which is better. Obviously, it's better to eat smaller portions of shit than extremely large portions of shit, but it's better to not eat shit at all. But one of the things that made me realize I had to change on that. So I was reading very carefully the clinical studies of Ozempic and Wegovy. By the way, they're literally the same thing. They're just marketed for different purposes. They're exactly the same drug. And if you look at all the long-term studies, we don't have that many long-term studies, but if you look at the long-term studies, basically the graph is pretty much always the same. The graph of averages is almost always the same. Huge weight loss. Then it stabilizes, it plateaus. And then if you look at the end of the study, which is usually about 60 months in, it slightly ticks back up again. Now, it's a very small ticking up. I don't want to exaggerate this. It's, you're still, even at the point where you're ticking up, you're much, much less overweight than you were at the start. But obviously, I was keen to see, well, hang on a minute, is this something, an effect that wears off? We know that developing tolerance for drugs is a very common phenomenon. If you think, for example, about amphetamines, right? If you take amphetamines for weight loss, which used to be very common in the 60s and 70s, it's not a good idea, partly because you become psychotic because you don't sleep, pretty bad side effect, but also, or not always, but often, but also we develop tolerance to amphetamines. So you have to take higher and higher doses to get the same effect. And lots of drugs are like that. And some drugs you don't ever develop tolerance. Antihistamines, for example, we don't know why, but people don't develop tolerance to antihistamines. So I wanted to know, well, do we develop tolerance to this? It's really important because if we do develop tolerance to it, then there can still be a case for these drugs, but the case would be, well, they're opening a window for change, but it's a window that closes, right? And the truth is we don't know if you develop tolerance or not yet. So the people who say we don't say, and there's some very reputable scientists who say we don't, they say, well, look, diabetics have been taking these drugs for 18 years. And we know that diabetics don't seem to be developing tolerance because they don't need higher and higher doses to control their diabetes to the same level. So that's a pretty powerful case that they don't. On the other hand, it could affect obesity very differently to diabetes. There are people like my friend's mother, Michelle Landsberg, who I interviewed for the book, who did lose a huge amount of weight and then just gradually regained it. So we don't know. People haven't been taking it long enough for weight loss for us to know whether they develop tolerance. But there's a possibility that we do, and therefore, or that there may be some other reason why over time it will cease working so well, which means that at the very least, either way, you should seize the opportunity. Okay, these drugs, they can interrupt your unhealthy eating patterns and therefore give you a chance to radically change. And that after 7 months of them just basically, like you say, sort of banking the weight loss but doing nothing else, I was like, okay, I need to really make some big changes now. And actually led me to learn a lot about my body, about the way I had been thinking and feeling, and led to a whole series of kind of lifestyle changes as well, which have sort of, I think, reinforced the effects of the drug or enhanced the effects of the drug, I should say.
Based on the research, Johan, or even personal experience, because I know you have a chapter in the book about, I think it's Why Don't You Diet and Exercise Instead, I think is the title of the chapter. And that's where most people's brains will go. Now, I don't want to be one of those fitness professional wankers that's like, diet and exercise, because I do think there's a time and a place when certain things work for certain people. In this case, there's context. I'm a believer in the 0 to 1 principle. Like, you have morbidly obese people or people who will never make a lifestyle change, and this might be the thing that helps them do that. And then they can potentially taper off the drug, maybe come off it altogether and reduce any risks that might potentially come. Again, as you said, those studies haven't been done long enough, so we don't know yet. But is there anything, either through the research or first-hand experience, that really surprised you about it, either good, bad, or positive, negative, that either through the experience firsthand or when you were speaking to people, you're like, oh, that's actually, I didn't see that coming? Did anything blindside you? Yeah.
The thyroid cancer risk, for example. Mm-hmm. So this is, I mean, I have lots of worries about these drugs, and it is I don't think it's the most likely scenario, but it is a plausible scenario that we're having a rerun. I think it's quite unlikely, but it's definitely possible that we're having a rerun of what happened in the 90s with a drug called fen-phen. So there was a hugely popular diet drug called fen-phen in the United States and some parts of Europe in the early 1990s. It's a combination drug. So it was a combination of two drugs, fluoramine, which is a very powerful appetite suppressant. But the problem with that is that it makes you very drowsy, so it had never been very popular. So they paired it with an amphetamine called phentermine. And when you put them together, the sort of amphetamine cancels out the drowsiness and also has an additional weight loss effect because you eat less when you're on amphetamines. And it was massive. I mean, there were 18 million fen-phen prescriptions in 1996 in the United States alone. A staggering number, right? And then it was discovered that it had a series of absolutely horrific side effects, which in fact the drug company had known about and had hidden. One of them was that it caused the blood vessels in your lungs to contract, which made breathing quite painful. So it causes primary pulmonary hypertension. You were 30 times more likely to develop primary pulmonary hypertension. it was horrific. The drug had to be withdrawn. Also caused heart defects for thousands of people. The company involved ended up making, at the time, the biggest settlement in the history of drugs. It was $12 billion they had to pay out to people who were harmed, or the families of people who died as a result. So there's a few warning signs. Now, I want to be clear, the vast majority of scientists believe it is highly implausible that this is a rerun of fen-phen. Fen-phen was put on the market based on a single study of 120 people, whereas the new weight loss drugs have been tested on enormous numbers of people. And as I say, they have been taken by diabetics. The semaglutide, which is Ozempic Wegovy, has been taken by diabetics for 18 years. So, weigh this differently. But based on the evidence accumulated over the last 18 years, there are some reasons to be concerned. I think the biggest one in terms of sort of physical side effects is the risk about thyroid cancer. So what we know that when you give these drugs to rats, when you give semaglutide, which is Ozempic Wegovy, to rats, they are much more likely to develop thyroid cancer. So of course people and this makes sense, these drugs work on something called GLP-1, a hormone called GLP-1, and we know that we have receptors for GLP-1 in our thyroid. So there's a sort of plausible understanding of why it would affect the thyroid in particular. And so a French scientist called Professor Jean-Luc Fahy, who's at the University Hospital in Montpellier, he was put in charge by the French regulatory agency to investigate, well, could there be any causation here between taking these drugs and thyroid cancer? And the French government has extremely good, arguably the best in the world, medical databases, because everyone's medical data goes onto it. And so what Professor Fahy and his colleagues did is they compared the thyroid cancer outcomes for an extremely large group of diabetics who had taken these drugs to an extremely large group of diabetics who had not taken these drugs. What they found was pretty shocking. The people who had taken these drugs had a 50 to 75% increase in their risk of thyroid cancer. Now, I want to be clear about that. That doesn't mean that if you take these drugs, you've got a 50 to 75% chance of getting thyroid cancer. If that was the case, no, obviously the drugs would be immediately withdrawn from the market. No one would take them. What it means is, if this study is correct, whatever your thyroid cancer risk was going in, it will be increased by 50 to 75%, right? Now, there are scientists who dispute this. The European Medicines Agency has looked at this evidence and said they are not yet persuaded. But these are very reputable French scientists, and there are others who are disagreeing and saying we don't have enough data and so on. But that was one of the first things where I was like, oh, that's bad. Now, against that, the advocates of the drugs would say thyroid cancer is a very small risk. So even a 50 to 75% increase in a very small risk remains a small risk. You have to compare that to the risk of cancer that is caused by obesity, right? Obesity massively increases your risk of developing all sorts of cancers. 4 to 8 cancers 4 to 8 forms of cancer have been shown to be caused in part by obesity. There's lots of evidence for that. So you're weighing risk. It's one of the very complicated things with this. All along, you're weighing kind of two kinds of risk. You're weighing the risk of ongoing obesity versus the risk of these drugs. And as one of the experts said to me, we don't know the long-term risks of these drugs, but we do know the long-term risks of obesity, and they're horrendous. That was a woman called Dr. Shauna Levy, who's at Tulane Medical School in New Orleans. So obviously when I'm weighing these risks, and there's lots of other risks that we can talk about, some of them I actually think even more chilling than that, potentially. Obviously, the obvious response is to go, as one of my friends said to me over dinner one night, well, why are you acting like that's the choice? There's a third choice, which is lose weight the way everyone else does, go on a diet and exercise. And I can explain why some of the flaws in it, and certainly people should try that first, but I can explain why that hadn't worked for me if you want.
I would like to unpack that, because I think long-term listeners of this podcast will know, obviously, as a fitness professional, I would be the first to say, look, try nutrition, try exercise, look at your lifestyle changes, etc. But it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do think that there's potential, as I mentioned, people who need this, because you're in this, it's nearly like a seesaw. You're trying to weigh up the risks, the costs, the benefits of, obesity and the all risk mortality and cancer risk going up versus the potential side effects and, thyroid potential cancer and the potential increase based on the drug. So it's a gray. There's no black and white in this. It's a very gray topic. Why did it not work for you? Because I want to tie this in, because something that was very chilling, and I'm not sure if it was meant to be chilling, was when you were talking about your niece, Erin, who's about 18 and was commenting how well you looked and that you lost a lot of weight. And then she was asking, can you get me some Ozempic? And I think that's where the real issue could be, where people that don't need this are tempted because of the effects and the impact and the quote unquote positive physical benefits that people are getting. Talk to us a little bit about why the traditional routes didn't work for you, and then weave it a small bit into the conversation with Erin, because I think that gives us a nice little tie into both ends of the spectrum.
Just to say about Erin first, I mean, it was the moment in the research for the book where I most thought, what the fuck are you doing, right? So Erin is the youngest member of my family, although my nephew just had a baby, so there was an even younger one now. But, she's always been the baby in my family. Like, it freaks me out when you say she's 18, because I'm always like, in my head, she's stuck at 6, right? No one in the world makes me more protective than her. Whenever she gets a boyfriend, and her boyfriend's always been very nice, I'm always tempted to go, get away from her, you pedo, because, like, in my head, she's 6, right? Anyway, she's always been a perfectly healthy, normal weight, right? And obviously, I've got lots of nephews and godsons, but she's the only girl, and I've always been very particularly keen with her to communicate messages about, feeling good in your body. And that moment, I just thought, oh shit, I've given her a really fucking bad message here, right? And then I had more complex thoughts about that, but you're absolutely right. One of the risks of these drugs is there are huge numbers of people taking them who were not overweight or obese to start with. They want to go from being a healthy weight to being super thin, right? For all sorts of reasons that are very obvious. And this is obviously much more an issue for women than for men, although there are some men in that position as well, right? And that's really, really, really dangerous. There's lots of reasons why. One is in relation to muscle mass. So when you lose a lot of weight, anyway, if you lose weight, any method you lose weight, you tend to lose muscle mass. And as you grow older, people with low levels of muscle mass are much more likely to develop problems with their bones, are much more likely to fall, they're much more likely to struggle to do things like climb the stairs. So you could be these people who were already thin and are taking it to be super thin could be setting in place all sorts of health problems for themselves. That's very different to, when you're calculating the risk, if you're 25 stone, the risk of not losing weight is very high. If you're 10 stone, the risk of losing weight is very high, right? So we're talking about a kind of array of risks at different ends of the weight spectrum. And that's a really big problem. And clearly, huge numbers of the people who are taking these drugs were not overweight to start with.
Hence the Hollywood party that you were at.
Exactly. I mean, almost no one there was fat to start with, right? So they had gone, they would take it for, as my friend Elise Lonan used to work at Goop and is one of the wisest observers of Hollywood madness. She said to me, we've gone from cutting back to kind of eliminating things. She won't go out for dinner with people in LA anymore because no one eats over dinner. She's like, why the fuck did we come out for dinner? None of you are eating anything, right? And that's obviously disastrous for people's health. It's one of the other big health risks is malnutrition. A lot of people are developing malnutrition taking these drugs. So that's another set of risks. But when we think about, okay, why didn't you diet and exercise instead? I want to stress there are huge, even if exercise is not a good tool to get to weight loss, there are huge benefits to exercising, even if it doesn't mean you produce weight. And the evidence for this is overwhelming. Exercise reduces the risk of developing over 200 diseases and complications, right? So if you are, a bit overweight or even significantly overweight and you exercise a lot and it doesn't mean you shed weight, it still massively boosts your health, right? So weight loss is not the only purpose of exercise, and you can improve your health without losing weight. Although there's still, beyond a healthy BMI, you're still incurring more risk if you're not able to lose it, because excess fat causes health problems. Look, obviously dieting works in the short to medium term. If you burn more calories than you lose, it's a simple fact of physics that you will lose weight, right? But I went and interviewed in Minneapolis a brilliant person called Professor Tracy Mann, who's done some of the most detailed and interesting research on diet in the world. And when she started studying this way back in the year 2000, she noticed a kind of strange thing. If you look at the research on diets, it's very clear they work. Burn more calories than you take in, you will lose weight. But she noticed a kind of weird thing, which is that these studies that demonstrate that almost always stop at 3 or 6 months after you start the diet, right? So it's like, yeah, they act like you lose weight, you get to that lower point, and then you live happily ever after at that lower weight. She said, well, that doesn't seem to be the case, right? So she then did what's called a meta-analysis. She looked at all the studies that had never been done of people who dieted for 2 years, or there were a handful who of 5 years. And what they found was quite different. What they find is generally when you diet, you lose quite a lot of weight 3 to 6 months, and then you put almost all of it back on. In fact, at the 2-year mark, people were on average 2 pounds lighter than they had been at the start. So not quite nothing, but pretty close, right? And at first that just seems really weird. How could that be, right? How could it be that, you're taking less calories? Why would you not be losing weight? And there's lots of things that are going on, but the best explanation we have of this, and it also may be a good explanation of why the drugs work, although that's more contested, is to understand it, you have to understand something called set point theory. So it's very easy to understand set point theory when it comes to your body's temperature, right? So your body wants you to be, 39 degrees, something like that, right? 39 degrees centigrade, right? So if your temperature goes above 39 degrees, you'll start to sweat. That's your body trying to get your temperature down again, right? And it'll make you pant a bit, that's your body automatically. You don't control that. You can't decide to not sweat. That's your body's mechanisms automatically bringing your temperature down to a healthy level. Or if you drop below that healthy temperature, if you're really cold, it'll make you shiver because that warms you up, right? So your body automatically tries to stabilize you at the natural temperature set point, which is just innate. It's just set in your body, right? Nothing you can do can change it. It used to be thought until the kind of late 60s, early 70s, that when you're born, you also have a weight set point, that there's just a natural percentage of body fat that your body wants you to be. And yeah, you can go above and below it, just like you can go to the Sahara Desert and you can go to the Arctic, but your body will fight to keep you at this fixed set point. But then the obesity crisis happened at an extraordinary rate. The year I was born, 1979, as I mentioned before, 6% of British people were obese. Now it's 27%, right? So it seemed to completely throw set point theory out the window. Well, obviously, how could that be, right? If your set point was innate and natural, how could it be that you would suddenly, so many people would gain so much weight so rapidly? But then people like Professor Michael Lowe, who I interviewed, who's in Philadelphia, a brilliant kind of expert on hunger at Drexel University, he explained to me that set point theory is true, it just needed to be adapted. So it looks like what happens is your body does try to fix your weight, but if you gain weight, your body will take your new highest weight as your natural set point. It will try to keep you at that level. So you might start off, your natural set point might be 18% body fat, but you gain a lot of weight to 25% body fat. It will try to then keep you at 25% body fat. We know that because when people try to lose weight, all sorts of biological mechanisms, which are the equivalent of sweating and shivering, kick in. It will slow down your metabolism. It'll make you crave sweet and fatty foods. It'll release certain hormones that trigger hunger. There's lots of evidence for this, right? And at first, because that seems really weird, why would that be? Why would your body make you do something that makes you unhealthy? And the reason is almost certainly rooted in our evolution. If you think about the circumstances where we evolved, our bodies did nothing to prepare us for an environment where there was just abundant, high levels of calories that would last forever, right? That just never happened in human history. So our bodies didn't prepare us for that. What our bodies prepared us for was a different risk that was very common throughout human history, which was famine, right? If you were a human being and you had a big supply of food, it would make logical sense for you to chomp it all down and build up your fat stores, because at any moment there could be a famine. And in a famine, the fattest person at the start is going to be the last man standing, right? Whereas Kate Moss is going to die very quickly in a famine. Me at my fattest would have been like, haha, laughing to the end, right? Well, perhaps not laughing. I would have been miserable in a famine, but you see what I mean, right? So this thing that powered our survival for so long and is very healthy, or at least helpful in the kind of environment we evolved to live in, is disastrous in the environments we now live in, right? Dr. Giles Yeo, a brilliant obesity researcher at Cambridge University, said to me, for these reasons, your brain hates it when you lose weight, and it will fight very hard to keep you at your highest weight level, right? So that's why exercise is definitely worth doing for all sorts of reasons, but it's surprisingly not that effective for weight loss in most cases, certainly not all. And diet, again, 2 to 5 years for the vast majority of people. It's found. Now, that's not everyone. All of us watching will know someone who's an outlier. A very close family member of mine lost an enormous amount of weight through changing his diet. And, the evidence is clear. There is a small minority of people who can do that. But for the vast majority of people, in the medium term, it doesn't work, right? Doesn't mean it's not worth trying. It should certainly be the first thing people try. But, I'm guessing almost everyone who's considering taking these drugs, have tried dieting. 17% of us are on a diet at any given time, right? My God, I had tried dieting, right? And I had tried exercise. For me, the best case for these drugs lies in that science. The truth is, for most of us, we're in a trap, and this is the only trap door we're being offered at the moment. Now, you have to weigh that benefit against all the risks, and for many people, the risks will outweigh the benefits. And I respect the people who come to that judgment, and they may well turn out to be right. And if we're having this conversation in 20 years and I'm riddled with thyroid cancer or got all sorts of the other problems that may be associated with these drugs, then I'm going to agree with you. But yeah, that's sort of the broad overview of how I think about that question.
It's so interesting, and I agree completely that very few people will have long-term sustainable weight loss without working with the professional in some capacity. And that's not a pitch for me or my program or any of my services. There's loads of great coaches, nutritionists, people out there, but you generally need professional help with it. Like if you got to a place, it's the same as a therapist. If you've got anxiety and depression and mental health, you can listen to podcasts, you can read your books. And as I mentioned, it was one of the biggest tipping points for me in terms of aha moments that I actually need more connection in my life, because I'd never done that dot or drawn those dots. But I also needed therapy, and I needed to work with professionals because I had an issue and a problem, and I wouldn't have got to where I am today without them. So I think evaluating your starting point and where you want to go is important. And then what tool are you going to use to get there? I'm always hesitant to recommend or promote a drug when there's an alternative option. But if you've exhausted those options and they haven't worked, then it's a case of, okay, maybe you need to look into this as an option. As I said, I never want to be black or white on a topic that's grey.
And I would say, I agree with everything you've just said. I would also just qualify, and I know you would agree with this, what the word worked means there, because the benefit of exercise is multifold. You feel better, it reduces your risk of all sorts of disease, and it might help you lose weight, but that's rarer, right? So if your only criterion for does it work is does it make you lose weight, then I would say you need to expand your criteria, right? Because there's all sorts of things that are really important in life, and weight loss is valuable if you were a BMI that can harm you, where you're carrying so much excess weight that it poses the serious risk of harming your health. But even setting that aside, there are loads of benefits you can get from exercise, and there are loads of benefits you can get from eating better and more healthily as well, obviously.
Yeah, 100%. Johan, I want to ask one final question, if that's okay. But before we do that, for those who want to pick up the book, I'll obviously link it in the description. I'm sure there'll be an audio version as well, because all the other books are on audio. Is there anywhere in particular you want to send people straight to the book, to the website? I know you kind of come in and out of social media when you're in book promotion mode, but is there anywhere else you'd like to send people before I get on to the last question?
Yeah, if you go to my website, it's www.johannhari.com. You can see the book. You can click on that. You can see where to buy it. You can buy it pretty much anywhere where books are sold. You can also get the audiobook. I'm about to go and record it a couple of days after we're having this conversation, so it'll be available by the time this is out. And yeah, you can also see where to follow me on social media, although I almost never look at it. One of the very few things I ever log into is Instagram to Steve Ryan's feed, and it's for insalubrious reasons, let's just say.
And I'm grateful for it. The occasional shirtless selfie from Johann Hari. I'm like, come on, Johan. Appreciate that. Appreciate the support.
You'll notice I don't like any of the other ones.
Rightly so. Johan, I will link all of those in the description for people. Check out the book. As I mentioned, it's an incredible resource with those who want to learn the good, the bad, the ugly. I think that's the beauty of it. It's painting that black, white picture with all the gray in between, that this is what you need to be aware of. So I highly recommend it for people. I want to ask one final question, and I know you wrapped the book up in this, so I don't want to give it away too much, but you talked about how you had that internal conflict and how it faded a little bit. Where do you stand now? Because obviously there's good, there's bad, there's ugly, there's beautiful, there's all the things that you've experienced, you've seen. How are you feeling about weight loss drugs in general, Ozempic in particular, in this current moment?
It's so interesting because talking to people who've read the book. So, for example, I went to see the marketing teams at my two publishers. I've got an American publisher and a British publisher. And it was so interesting. It was a bit like, do you remember that dress where some people saw it as, I saw it as gold and black, but I forget what other people saw it as. So some people came up to me and said, Johan, I loved your book. It made me absolutely convinced I must go out and take an Ozempic. And some people came up to me and said, Johan, I loved your book. It made me think you had to be a fucking maniac to take Ozempic, right? And I was like, wow, this is really interesting. It was like, and some people, of course, had a position in the middle, and that made me think, oh, I've done my job right, because I've tried to present the range of evidence. It's a bit different to my previous books where I started with more of a sense of, they were open-minded journeys to some degree, but I started with a set of ideas, right? And with this one, I was much more open-minded. Where I am now, well, I'm continuing to take it, which I think tells you something. I'm very worried about some things. I'm very worried about the eating disorders risk. There's a lot of people who want to starve themselves. It's been rising throughout the pandemic. And this is a tool to amputate your appetite. And that really worries me. So one of the things we should be really urgently doing is we need to stop prescribing these drugs over Zoom, right? It's easy to bullshit over Zoom about what your weight is. These drugs should only be prescribed in person by doctors who have training in spotting eating disorders, right? So setting aside some concerns like that, we shouldn't set those concerns aside, but you know what I mean? Like, having said that, my broad advice for people listening would be, if your BMI is higher than 35 and you don't have thyroid cancer in your family and you don't have a kind of history of depression, I would say for you, the benefits of these drugs probably outweigh the risks. If your BMI is lower than 25, you definitely should not take the drugs, and the risks far outweigh the benefits, right? Because the only real benefit is being super thin as opposed to a normal weight, and I don't even regard that.
I'm just going to add to that, Johan, sorry to cut across here, but just from a professional standpoint, for BMI for non-athlete or weightlifting individuals, because I'm clinically obese on a BMI scale, and I'm I think 10% body fat. So just to give people an idea on that, in case they go with a one size fits all, if you don't weight train, you're not an athlete, you have a high BMI, but it's purely body fat that's high, that's what you're speaking about here. So just to caveat on that.
That's a really good point. So obviously, BMI measures fat mass, but not muscle mass. It's one of the many flaws with BMI, although it's a tool that matches up with all the other tools we have. But yeah, absolutely. And look, everyone listening, whether your BMI is high because of muscle mass or fat mass, right? Like occasionally you get people who are like, hugely overweight, who'll kind of go, well, BMI isn't a good measure because look, it measures muscle mass. And then you want to go, and some of the doctors said to me, right, I'm looking at the patient, I'm saying, right, but you do not have a high BMI because you've got high muscle mass. I can see that, right? But yeah, so with that very important caveat, I mean, for the people whose BMI is between around 25, 27 and 35, I think it's a more finely balanced decision, right? My BMI was 30 at the start. It's now, I think, 24, 23. The percentage of fat has gone down just staggeringly. I'm in the lucky position. I haven't lost any muscle mass, or which maybe because my muscle mass was so pathetically small at the start. But it's not like I'm not Arnold Schwarzenegger. But although Arnold Schwarzenegger did endorse my previous book, which was one of the happiest moments in my life. Also remind me to tell you in a minute a really unfortunate Arnold Schwarzenegger related story. But yeah, if you're in between, I think you've got to weigh the risks very carefully, and it's ambiguous and it's not totally clear. But one of my favorite writers, Graham Greene, said, when we're unsure, we are alive, right? And I felt unsure when I was writing this book, and I felt weirdly alive. This is a new drug, it's a new development. There's a lot we know, but there's a lot we don't know, and we've got a lot of risks to weigh up. It's complicated, and whether we get, the stakes are really high, right? Whether we get this right or not will determine whether huge numbers of people, like the friend I mentioned at the start, whether they live or die. So it's a debate I take really seriously. Can I tell you my unfortunate Arnold Schwarzenegger story?
Please do.
Quite apart from the fact that he picked my book as his book of the month, which made me really chuffed. I got in trouble on Australian radio because I was asked to go on not that long ago to talk about my book Stolen Focus, which was about, why people are struggling to pay attention. And I slightly misjudged the tone. So I had done this very comic Australian podcast immediately before. And then I didn't realize I was on a quite serious, like the equivalent of like Panorama or something. And they asked me a question about generative AI and ChatGPT. And I said, I'm actually really disappointed with AI. And they said, oh, why? And I said, because when I was a kid, I was led to believe that AI developments would lead to a hot, naked Arnold Schwarzenegger trying to track me down. And instead, all it's done is led to like slightly wrong answers to basic questions, right? And there was this long silence and the host just said, what? I thought, oh shit, I've really misjudged this. I keep making these mistakes on Australian radio. I got banned from an Australian radio show because I made a horrific mistake where for Stolen Focus, I went offline for 3 months completely. I went to this place called Provincetown, as you know, and had no internet and no phone for 3 months. And it's a little kind of gay town in Cape Cod. And I was on this Australian podcast and they said to me, well, Australians wouldn't really know what Provincetown is. How would you explain it? And there's this place called Byron Bay where I've been, which is like a surfing town. And I said, well, if you picture Byron Bay with less surfing and more fisting, you've probably got the right idea. And there was this like horrendous pause. And they were like, and I said, as a joke, I've got this terrible thing where if I say a joke and someone doesn't laugh, I lean into it. I said, oh, I'm sorry, I was led to believe this was a fisting-based podcast. Was I misinformed? And they just looked absolutely fucking horrified. They were like, yeah, you're never coming back on our show ever again. Who the fuck is this person? So it was very, very unfortunate.
Johan, and that just closes the loop to why you're one of my favorite people, I think.
Right.
Johan, as I've mentioned, it's the pleasure. Every time we get to speak, I'm always so grateful for it. I think you're an incredible storyteller, a wonderful person, one of my favorite authors of all time. Your ability to get across a message is just second to none. I'm going to link the book for people. Go check it out. Go give a follow on Instagram, although he probably won't see fuck all of what you post or comment on or like. But give him a follow anyway. Pick up the book. And Johan, keep doing what you're doing. And thank you so much again.
What a pleasure. Cheers, Brian. Thanks so much.
That was multiple New York Times bestselling author Johann Hari on the extraordinary benefits and disturbing risks of Ozempic and other weight loss drugs. We went a little bit longer than normal on this podcast, but hopefully you see why Johann is one of those people that I could literally, and all of our podcasts have gone quite long because he is an incredible storyteller. We could go in a million different directions, and just the story at the end is just one of my favorites. It just sums up why I love him so much. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a rating and a review. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can leave a rating and review. If you're on Spotify, you can leave a rating, and it helps massively with the growth of the show and allows me to bring on other great guests like Johan to serve you on your journey. Hopefully you enjoyed today's podcast as much as I enjoyed recording it. Catch you all next Monday.